Okay, thank you, Jim, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today, both in present and remotely. Today is the day that looms in the back of the mind of every grad student, and it's surreal to finally be here presenting the culmination of 3 hard years of work. My thesis research, which examined how occupancy and behavior of barn owls influence their roadway mortality here in southern Idaho. Roadway occupancy and behavior of owls hasn't received very much study as it relates to roadway mortality, and none of those studies have taken place here in the United States. Barn owls are members of the family Strigidae, Tytonidae, which is different from the family Strigidae, which are most typical owl species that people are familiar with. They're separated by many physiological and morphological characters. They typically inhabit grasslands and areas of agricultural development because those areas facilitate high rodent populations, which are the primary prey of barn owls, and also because agricultural development provides nests and roost sites for barn owls in the open barns, the haystacks, and trees that are associated with that kind of land cover. Barn owls nest in cavities, and often populations are limited by their access to available cavity nest sites. They have extremely high reproductive rates. They can lay on average 6 eggs per clutch, but up to 10 to 11 eggs per clutch. Egg laying initiation date is in early to mid-March, and as soon as the first egg is laid, incubation begins, such that the young hatch asynchronously, and you might have as much of a 3-week difference between the youngest nestling and the oldest nestlings in one clutch. Barn owls are relatively short-lived in the wild. They only live about 2 to 4 years as adults, and they have extremely high first-year mortality. Juvenile mortality is on the order of 65 to 75% that do not survive their first year of life. And the juvenile survival rate is actually the most critical life history parameter for the population health of barn owls. Adults are highly sedentary and exhibit high site fidelity, so they're non-migratory. And after breeding in a nest box, they tend to roost there year-round. If one member of the pair loses its mate, it will remain there until it acquires a new mate and then begin breeding again. Juveniles, on the other hand, exhibit quite extreme natal dispersals, anywhere from 1 to over 1,500 kilometers. Barn owls are strictly nocturnal in their foraging habits, unlike other typical owl species that you might see active during dawn or dusk. They also hunt on the wing, which is different from normal raptors and owl species, which are more sit and wait predators. While they're hunting on the wing, they're listening for their prey using their excellent low light vision and hearing, which is some of the most sensitive ever tested by science. And they are small mammal specialists, and they particularly prefer meadow voles and then Peromyscus or deer mice. Barn owls are found on every continent except for Antarctica. However, they're in decline across most of their worldwide range. Populations in Europe are listed as endangered or have become locally extirpated. In Canada, barn owls are found in British Columbia, where they're listed as threatened, and they're also found in Ontario, where they're listed as endangered. Here in the United States, 7 states consider them a species that is threatened or endangered, and 9 other states have them listed as a species of special concern. Here in Idaho, they have no such special designation. There are several reasons for these declines. Either one or more may be acting synergistically to reduce barn owl populations. First, poisoning from pesticides. Barn owls prey on small mammals, which in agricultural areas, farmers put out rodenticides, and then those rodenticides can accumulate to toxic levels in the flesh of the barn owls until it's fatal. Probably more common is land use change. Many of the states in the United States that have barn owls listed as endangered are in the Midwest, where lots of the agricultural fields are being converted to subdivisions and development, and that results in a loss of available hunting and prey populations, and also removes nesting structures for barn owls. Finally, roadway mortality. Barn owls suffer the highest rates of road mortality of any raptor species. And as little as a 5% increase in road mortality rates can result in a 50% reduction in the population of barn owls. Roads are very important to human, social, governmental, and economic infrastructure, and as such, the number and area of roads are increasing worldwide. Currently, there are over 64 million kilometers of roads on Earth. The United States has 6 million kilometers of roads, and roads cover about 1% of the surface area of the United States. and that's an area roughly equal to the size of South Carolina for some spatial reference. In a study in 2003, Ritters and Whitcomb examined the proportion of total area within the certain distances of the nearest road, and a major finding of their study was that 83% of the surface area of the United States is within 1 kilometer of the nearest road, where roads were considered to be any type of road. And finally, because roads are so important, they're projected to increase by over 122,000 kilometers squared by 2030. As roads increase, so does the suite of ecological effects they have on the landscape. Currently, about 22% of the United States is affected by roads. And this suite of effects includes things like pollutant deposition, noise and light pollution, habitat fragmentation and degradation, and finally, perhaps what is the most obvious negative effect is direct mortality of wildlife through collisions with vehicles. Of all taxa that are affected by collisions with vehicles, birds are particularly susceptible. A recent review by Loss et al. Estimated that about 200 million birds are killed annually, and about 10 million birds are killed annually in Canada. And across all studies that quantify avian taxa, barn owls consistently rank as one of the most commonly encountered species during their road mortality surveys. Barn owls may be susceptible to roadway mortality for several reasons. First, the medians and verges of roadways harbor high small mammal densities, and that may attract barn owls there for hunting. Then while they're there hunting, spending time in and around the roadway corridor, they're exhibiting their low, slow flight. It's about 1 to 3 meters above the ground, which is directly at the level of oncoming traffic. In contrast, barn owls may be trying to cross from one side to the other to access suitable habitat and were killed in their attempts to cross the highway. Roadway mortality of barn owls is a problem across much of their worldwide range, as I mentioned earlier. This table shows the rates of barn owl mortality given in owls per 100 kilometers per year as a function of location. And so Germany, Switzerland, France, several studies in Portugal and California have all quantified rates of roadway mortality. But recently in 2012, a study conducted by Boves and Beltoff quantified what is currently the world's highest known rate of barn owl roadway mortality. It occurs right here in southern Idaho on the stretch of I-84 that runs from Boise to Burley, Idaho. They estimate that over 1,500 barn owls are killed annually on this stretch of interstate. Another important thing to note about this table is that all of these estimates are naive estimates. So they're unadjusted for things like observer bias, crippling bias, which are owls that are injured, fly away from the roadway, and then succumb, or scavenger removal of carcasses. And in their study, Boves and Beltoff adjusted for some of those factors, and what they found was incredible, that these estimates are actually underestimating actual mortality rates by up to 50%. So there are many studies on barn owl roadway mortality that have established certain patterns. And so some of these patterns are that mortality varies seasonally and annually. This figure is taken from the Boves and Beltoff study. It shows number of owls as a function of months of the year across both years of their study. And it's clear that many more owls were killed in year 2 in the blue bars than compared to year 1 in the red bars. There's a sex-related bias to mortality where females are killed much more often than males. And there's an age-related bias to mortality where juveniles experience higher mortality rates than adults. Here in southern Idaho, approximately 75% of all dead barn owls are juveniles. We also know that mortality varies spatially in southern Idaho. Although mortality occurs along the entire study route, there are areas that account for many more dead barn owls than others. So this map shows the entire survey route, and I've blown up a portion of it to show some of the what we call hotspots of mortality. They're indicated by the warmer colors, and then the cooler colors or absence of colors are few to no barn owls being killed. The interesting thing to note here is that these 3 hotspots account for only 4% of the entire 300-kilometer route, but together they account for over 20% of the mortality on that entire stretch of interstate. Although there are patterns we are familiar with, there are still many questions that remain to be answered about barn owl road mortality. First, we don't know owl occurrence in relation to the interstate, what factors influence barn owl occupancy, and then how barn owl occupancy relates to their mortality. This figure is a heuristic for thinking about different patterns that might occur between barn owl mortality and occupancy. First, on the diagonal line, here is a scenario that makes most sense, a proportional relationship between the two. As occupancy increases, so does the probability of mortality on the interstate. In the off diagonal, or the red squares, are scenarios that might be a little more unique. First, one scenario is that we might have extremely low occupancy in regions surrounding the interstate, but extremely high mortality rates on adjacent interstate segments. And that might indicate that the interstate is functioning as an ecological trap, where barn owls are attracted across long distances to hunt along the interstate or for whatever reason, and then are struck and killed. In contrast, I-84 could be functioning as a barrier to owl movements. A scenario indicating this might be extremely high occupancy in regions adjacent to the interstate, and then very low mortality on those interstate segments, suggesting that owls are avoiding interacting with or crossing the interstate. We also don't know owl behavior in relation to the interstate. Are owls differentially attracted to certain segments but not others? If so, why? Are owls crossing the interstate or hunting the interstate when they're struck and killed? These bring me to the objectives of my research. My first objective was to develop occupancy models to understand what factors best predict barn owl occurrence in southern Idaho. My second objective was to use those occupancy models to predict occupancy and then compare that with mortality on I-84 to examine the relationship between the two. And then my final objective was to conduct a behavioral and movement study to assess barn owl habitat selection near I-84. My study area encompasses a roughly 34-kilometer wide, 300-kilometer long band with I-84 as a central feature. It's shown in the blue here. The major land cover types in that area were irrigated agriculture, sage steppe, and disturbed grassland. And then the Snake River Canyon is a major geological feature that runs through most of my study area. To address my first objective, I conducted a series of nighttime point counts. They were randomly selected and constrained to be at least a kilometer apart so that I avoided double counting individual owls in one night's survey period. Once I reached those locations in the field, I conducted 3 repeat surveys for a total of 16 minutes at each location. This meant I could get about 12 done on a good night, 14 done on a great night, and 8 done on a bad night. I used a hybrid survey protocol combining silent listening with broadcast of barn owl vocalizations, and I also used spotlights. So previous literature suggested that barn owls are not vocally responsive to conspecific broadcast, unlike other typical owl species. Using broadcast is a common way to survey for owls such as spotted owls, barred owls, great horned owls, but not so much for barn owls. So I used spotlights in the hope that that would augment detection of non-vocally responsive barn owls. This is a visualization of the entire survey sequence. It started with 5 minutes of silent listening and spotlighting, followed by 30 seconds of broadcast and 5 more minutes of silent listening for survey 2, and then the third survey was a repeat of the second protocol. So these are all the locations I surveyed, shown in purple in my study area. If we take a closer look, during the winter of 2015, which corresponds to the early breeding season of barn owls, I surveyed 222 individual locations, 3 times for a total of 666 point counts. During the fall of 2015, I revisited a subset of 67 of those points, which corresponds to the post-breeding season of barn owls, conducted the 3 repeat point counts for a total of 201. This map shows all of the locations where barn owls were detected in yellow across both survey seasons. In more detail, during the early breeding season, I detected barn owls at 39 of 222 locations, and during 52 of 666 point counts. During the post-breeding season, I detected barn owls during 31 of 67 locations, and during 50 of 201 point counts. Once I had conducted the fieldwork, or once I was collecting the data, my entire overarching objective was an occupancy analysis framework. And the main goal is to understand the environmental factors that influence the occurrence of a species. So for barn owls, this might be things such as trees, noise and light pollution, streams, development, crops, more noise pollution, and roads. But once a biologist gets out in the field and starts surveying for their target species, immediately you run into many problems. So there are several scenarios that occurred while I was out surveying for owls. First, in reality, there was a barn owl present. I detected the barn owl. This makes Tempe very happy because she's collecting quality data. The second scenario, there's no barn owl present. I failed to detect the barn owl because it's not there. So it's kind of a boring result, but still I'm collecting data that reflects reality. The third scenario, however, is where problems arise. Say there's a barn owl present. I failed to detect it during my survey, and this is the critical issue that occupancy analysis is designed to overcome, something that's called imperfect detection. So to overcome imperfect detection, a biologist conducts repeat surveys, which is what I did in my 3 repeat point counts. From those surveys, a detection history is developed, and then that detection history is combined with detection variables to create a detection model. And then all subsequent occupancy modeling is now adjusted for imperfect detection, such that those models now give a more accurate representation of occupancy. So I collected data both in the field and in GIS on a suite of variables related to occupancy. Occupancy variables on this slide are shown in the gray boxes. They were broken down into 3 types: anthropogenic, road-related, and land cover variables. I also collected data on variables related to detection, so I could use those in the detection modeling process. In GIS, those variables on the previous slide were quantified in 1 and 5 kilometer radii of every single unique location I surveyed at. These scales are biologically significant to barn owls because a 1 kilometer scale corresponds with average nightly movements of barn owls, and 5 kilometers corresponds with the maximum estimated movements of barn owls. So the first step was to combine the detection history with the detection variables to create the detection model. Because I surveyed in 2 different seasons, the early and post-breeding season, all results are presented broken out by season. And these are the results of the detection modeling. Probability of detection was lower during the early breeding season than the post-breeding season. It was 0.32 in the early breeding season and 0.45 in the post-breeding season. These are the detection models for each season. In both seasons, broadcast call and Julian date were important. During the early breeding season, percent moon illumination and percent cloud cover were important for detection, whereas in the post-breeding season, those dropped out and background noise came in as an important variable. Probably the most interesting and gratifying finding of these detection models is that in both seasons, playback of barn owl vocalizations had a positive effect on my ability to detect barn owls, so it boosted detection, which was in contrast to what previous literature was suggesting at the time we were designing our study. When I looked at the number of detections broken out by detection type in both seasons, it's clear that I was hearing many more owls than I was just seeing them, or a combination of the 2 detection types. Again, indicating that barn owls are vocally responding to the playback more often than they are any other response type. So once I created the detection model, the next thing was to combine it with my occupancy variables to create the occupancy models. Those models were created again for the early breeding season and the post-breeding season at 2 scales in each season, 1 and 5 kilometers. Models were computed using AIC, where the lowest AIC indicates the best approximating model. And then also scale was examined using AIC, and the best scale was selected based on the lowest AIC value. And here are the results of those occupancy models. During the early breeding season, a 1 kilometer scale was better at predicting occupancy than a 5 kilometer scale. This table shows the parameters that were important in the top occupancy model. Those were crops, trees, and background noise. These figures are the relationships between the model predicted estimates of those parameters and occupancy in the top model. So in the upper left, we have occupancy as a function of proportion crops. As proportion crops increase, so does occupancy of barn owls. And this relationship is likely driven by the fact that agricultural lands facilitate high small mammal abundances, and barn owls are attracted to those areas because of the hunting opportunities they provide. On the upper right, we have occupancy as a function of background noise. And as background noise increases, occupancy decreases, probably because barn owls are acoustic specialists. They rely on their hearing to efficiently locate and capture their prey. So the higher background noise is, the less likely they are able to accomplish that. Another study in Idaho looked at the hunting efficiency of saw-whet owls in relation to gas compressor noise, and they found that saw-whet owls are unwilling or unable to efficiently capture their prey when background noise reaches 61 dBA. And interestingly, that was about the same threshold where occupancy of barn owls drops to 0. And the final figure is occupancy as a function of trees present or trees absent, and occupancy is higher when trees are present. Barn owls are limited by their access to nest sites, and trees in southern Idaho are hard to come by, so they're closely associated with trees because of the nest and roost sites they provide. During the post-breeding season, again, the 1 kilometer scale was better at predicting barn owl occupancy than the 5 kilometer scale. This is the top occupancy model for that season, and it contained different parameters than the early breeding season model. So in the post-breeding season, distance to the Snake River, proportion development, and cumulative stream length became the important parameters. These are the model predicted relationships between occupancy and those top parameters. On the upper left, we have occupancy as a function of distance from the Snake River, and as distance increases, occupancy decreases. And this is probably driven by 2 things. Number 1, the Snake River, with its steep canyons and volcanic rock, provides secure nest and roost sites for barn owls, so they're closely associated with it. Also in southern Idaho, which is a desert landscape, agriculture is closely associated with the Snake River, and the farther you get from the Snake River, the more you get into sage steppe and foothills, which are poor habitat for barn owls. In the upper right, occupancy as a function of proportion development. As development increases, occupancy decreases. Because development replaces agriculture and hunting opportunities for barn owls, and also noise and light pollution increase with development, which again probably deter barn owls. The final parameter was cumulative stream length. As cumulative stream length increases, occupancy increases. Southern Idaho is a desert landscape, and as such, there's not many trees. Most of the trees are closely associated with water features, streams, and irrigation ditches. So because of that, occupancy is probably higher with the more streams there are because of the trees that are there. All right, so once I developed my occupancy models, my second objective was to use those models to examine the relationship between occupancy and actual mortality on I-84. This was sort of a complicated process, so I'm going to walk you through it slowly and hopefully I don't lose you. The first thing was to use the early breeding and the post-breeding season models to generate predicted occupancy values at each one of my nighttime survey locations. But I only looked at locations that were within 5 kilometers of the interstate because those are the owls you can expect to be interacting with the interstate on a nightly basis. After that, I quantified mortality along I-84 in 1 kilometer segments shown by the yellow circles and 5 kilometer segments shown by the green box. All of this mortality data was collected through a series of systematic roadway surveys conducted by Thon Boves and Aaron Arnold in their thesis research. That mortality was then subset by season. So I broke it out by early and post-breeding season so I could compare it with my early and post-breeding season models. And then I examined the relation. Oh, I'm forgetting a step. And then I paired each location with its nearest 1 kilometer and its nearest 5 kilometer interstate segment. And then I examined the relationship between the two using a logistic regression analysis. So just looking at the predicted occupancy by season, predicted occupancy was much higher during the post-breeding season than the early breeding season. And this probably reflects an influx of juveniles dispersing into the population during the post-breeding season. The percent of 1 kilometer segments with dead owls was higher in the early breeding season at 39% than 20% in the post-breeding season. And the percent of 5 kilometer segments with dead owls was extremely high during the early breeding season at 95.5%, and then it was 43% during the post-breeding season. So I was curious about what are those segments with no dead owls. There's not very many of them. And when I looked at the data, I found that there were only 2 segments that registered no dead barn owls across 3 years of systematic roadway surveys. Those segments were consecutive and located just southeast of Boise, Idaho on I-84. And one of 2 scenarios may be occurring here. The first, which I think is less likely, is that this area represents a zone of population depletion, where previous extremely high roadway mortality rates have depressed the population to the point that it hasn't rebounded, so there's no dead owls. But when I examine the land cover in this area, what I actually think is occurring is that The surrounding landscape is sage steppe, and there's not a lot of close agriculture. So this is just an area of very poor habitat for barn owls. They're not there. My model predicted occupancy estimates in this area were very low. And so probably there's no owls there, so they're not getting killed. These are the results of the logistic regression analysis. They were broken out by scale, so this is the 1 kilometer interstate segments. It shows probability of mortality as a function of predicted occupancy during the early and post-breeding season. In general, as predicted occupancy increases, the probability of mortality increases in both seasons, but many more owls are being killed during the early breeding season than the post-breeding season. This figure shows the relationship at the 5 kilometer scale. At this scale, there was an interaction between the effect of predicted occupancy and season on mortality. During the early breeding season, many more barn owls are being killed, and they're being killed at rapid rates as occupancy increases. So on the figure, for a very small range of low occupancy values, we see a rapid increase in probability of mortality, such that when predicted occupancy is just 0.25, probability of mortality is spiked to 100%. So initially, this is an exciting result, but then if we think about it, this relationship is probably being driven by the fact that there are only 2 5-kilometer interstate segments with no dead barn owls. So there's not a lot of variation in the data, and perhaps then what it's saying is that 5 kilometers is not the best scale to be measuring roadway mortality of barn owls at. This is my favorite figure of my entire presentation. I was able to spatially project my early breeding season occupancy model throughout my study area with the help of many people. So what this is showing is predicted occupancy in the buffer around I-84. The blue areas are areas with high occupancy, and green and yellow are low occupancy. And then you can see I-84 running through the center. Red zones are dead zones, and then yellow are areas with some dead barn owls, and absence of color is no dead barn owls. And visually, this is very gratifying. Areas with the highest occupancy are lining up with the areas of highest mortality for the most part throughout my entire study area. So in summary, in both seasons, at both scales, as predicted occupancy increases, so does the probability of mortality. Which, if we remember that figure I showed in the beginning of this presentation, it's generally putting us along the proportional or the dotted line, just that as occupancy increases, so does mortality. Overall, I-84 is not functioning as an ecological trap or a barrier based on the results of my research. My third and final objective was to assess barn owl habitat selection movements in relation to I-84. To do this, I attached GPS data loggers to 4 adult male barn owls during the breeding season. GPS data loggers were attached backpack style, and I included a VHF telemetry unit and the GPS unit. I included the VHF tracker so that I could determine whether the owl was in the nest box or not before I attempted recapture, which is the caveat of using GPS data loggers. So they're very powerful in that they can capture extremely fine-scale location data, which is what I needed to answer my objectives. But in order to get any of the data back, you have to recapture the animal and remove the transmitter because they log the data, they don't upload it. So recapture was an iterative process. It took almost 2 months to get one of the owls back, but I was actually able to successfully capture all 4 of my males. I was able to program those GPS data loggers to take 30-second locations from 6 to 9 p.m. And then that was so that it corresponded with the onset of barn owl activity. Then I backed down fixed rate to once per minute from 9 p.m. to 12 a.m. in an effort to conserve battery life, but still get fine-scale locations. I examined the movements of those barn owls and calculated their home ranges. 2 owls were transmitted over 30 kilometers from I-84, and 2 were transmitted within 3 kilometers of I-84. The 95% isopleth home range varied greatly by individual, but was within ranges suggested by previous studies. The maximum movements of all 4 individuals were over 3 kilometers. This will be important in the next figure. And then the average movements varied greatly by individual on a nightly basis. These are the home range maps of the 2 males nesting closest to I-84. One male was outside Jerome, Idaho, and one was outside Wendell, Idaho. And a visual assessment of their home ranges and their movements showed several interesting things. First of all, both of these owls are nesting close to development, and they're completely shunning development in their nightly movements, which is supporting my occupancy model from my first objective. Secondly, both of these owls are nesting within 3 kilometers of the interstate, but their maximum movements were over 3 kilometers. So it's reasonable to assume that these owls could have been interacting with the interstate on a nightly basis. However, neither one ever approached closer than 1 kilometer to the interstate. And then when we visually assess the movements, in general, these owls are moving away from the interstate than towards the interstate. And if we kind of look at the habitat they're selecting for, they're actually going towards disturbed grassland. And this owl spent a lot of time in a disturbed grassland field here that was not under crop rotation. That cover type is what dominates along I-84. So they could have been finding those same hunting opportunities along the interstate, but instead they were seeking it elsewhere away from the interstate. So what that suggests is that at least for adult male barn owls during the breeding season, they're avoiding I-84 when they're in close proximity to it. To examine habitat use, I conducted a resource selection function, and I had to do some data manipulation filtration before I was able to run the analysis. So I brought the raw locations into ArcGIS. They were filtered to remove poor satellite locations with poor satellite reception. And then I filtered them at 5-minute intervals to reduce spatial and temporal autocorrelation, and that left me with about 300 to 500 locations for analysis per individual owl. Those locations were termed used. I then plotted 500 random points within a 3.5 kilometer buffer of every owl's nest box location. 3.5 kilometers just encompass the maximum movements of every individual. These random points served as an index of the available habitat for each individual to compare in the analysis. And then the final step was data extraction. I extracted to every used and available point data on terrain roughness or slope, distance-related variables, and then land cover type. The resource selection function was run as a generalized linear mixed model with a binomial distribution, a log link, and I included individual owls at random effect to control for variation between individuals. And then I modeled the likelihood that a location was used compared to available. And these are the results of the resource selection function. So I found that probability of use increases as terrain roughness or percent slope increases. This relationship is probably being driven by the Snake River Canyon being an attractive nest and roost site for barn owls, and that area has great topographic relief. The second figure shows probability of use as a function to distance to the nearest stream. As distance to the nearest stream increases, so does the probability of use. This was one of the more confounding results of this analysis, but I think it's maybe explained by the fact that barn owls are nesting in trees associated with streams, and then they fly out away from those streams into the surrounding landscape to hunt before returning to their nest site. However, my occupancy model and a study in Portugal examining presence of barn owls both found that barn owls are positively associated with streams when we look at occupancy. So in the bottom line, what this might be suggesting is that streams are more important for occupancy than they are for using in habitat selection analyses. On this figure on the left, we see probability of use as a function of distance to the nearest minor road. And as distance to the nearest minor road increases, probability of use dramatically decreases. In southern Idaho, where barn owls occur, it's an agricultural matrix, and those agricultural fields undergo a lot of rotation and disturbance. However, the strips of vegetation associated with secondary roads are always constant and provide refuge habitat for small mammals. So barn owls can always find their small mammal prey in those verges, and probably that's what's driving this relationship. On the left, we see probability of use. On the right, we see probability of use, as a function of distance to the nearest major road. As distance to the nearest major road increases, so does probability of use. Because major roads have higher traffic rates, so the noise and light pollution associated with those high traffic volumes probably deter barn owls. They're known to negatively affect other owl species such as burrowing owls and tawny owls, and several other studies of barn owls have found that barn owls will not approach a major road when in close proximity to it, and that they only tend to cross major roads when traffic rates are low. Here we see probability of use as a function of distance to the nearest tree. As that distance increases, probability of use decreases, potentially because trees are providing those nest and roost sites, and also because in southern Idaho there's a large population of great horned owls. Great horned owls compete with barn owls for prey and also prey upon barn owls themselves. And so trees might represent cover for barn owls to protect themselves from the great horned owls. The last figure shows probability of use as a function of land cover type. And in this particular figure, all of the probability of use of land cover types had to be calculated in reference to another land cover type. And I chose cultivated crops as the reference category because that's the most prevalent land cover type within my study area. So basically, any bars that are below this line indicate selection against, and any bars above this line are indicating land cover types that are used relatively more than cultivated crops. So development, hay pasture, and sage steppe were all used relatively less than cultivated crops. And grasslands and wetlands were all used relatively more than cultivated crops. Grasslands, again, are not under crop rotation. They're a stable environment where barn owls can consistently find prey year-round. During the time when I had transmitters on my barn owls, most of the agricultural fields are actually left fallow as dirt. And so because of that, barn owls are probably even more preferentially seeking grasslands to hunt in than those cultivated crop fields. Wetlands were used relatively more also. Some of my boxes were associated in areas of along wetlands or in wetlands, so a high proportion of locations were taken when the owl was visiting the nest box delivering prey. So to summarize all of this research, during the early breeding season occupancy model, I found that barn owls are positively associated with crops and trees and negatively associated with background noise. During the post-breeding season, occupancy of barn owls is positively associated with stream length and negatively associated with proportion development and increasing distance from the Snake River. When I examined the relationship between predicted occupancy and mortality on ID4, I found in general there's a positive relationship. As occupancy increases, so does the probability of mortality. And then in my behavioral study or movement study, I found that barn owls nesting as close as 2 kilometers from ID4 tended to move away from the interstate rather than towards it, suggesting that perhaps the interstate is functioning as a barrier to movements. In a study in 2012 conducted by Grillo et al. In Portugal, they transmitted 11 barn owls nesting near major roadways. 4 of those individuals were killed on major roadways and 4 others disappeared. But before that, they were able to calculate home ranges of 5 owls nesting near the roads. And they also found that those owls tended to situate their home ranges alongside or adjacent to the major roadway, but their home ranges did not encompass large portions of the roadway, either indicating it as a barrier or something that barn owls prefer to set home ranges up against but not include within. The management implications of my research: first, in contrast to what other studies were suggesting, broadcast is an effective way to survey for barn owls, and as such, future studies should incorporate broadcast in their methodology. My occupancy models, while I didn't have enough data to model validate, they did fit the data I had very well. So once they're validated, they might be useful for projecting occupancy in areas of proposed road development. And in that way, new roads can be sited in areas with lowest occupancy, and that way we'll be hopefully minimizing mortality after the road is constructed. If a road alignment has already been constructed, as is the case for ID4, we can spatially project occupancy and then site mitigation in areas with the highest occupancy. And remember my favorite figure, areas of highest occupancy correspond with areas of greatest mortality. And so if we site mitigation there, we're now killing 2 birds, 2 owls with 1 truck. No, just kidding. And then finally, what are the mitigation solutions? So the first mitigation solution is to install barriers to low flight. This has been suggested by several studies. Low flight barriers of forest barn owls, which are flying at 1 to 3 meters, to fly up and over the interstate and out of oncoming traffic. A second mitigation option might be to remove small mammal habitat in medians and verges, whether it's through mowing the vegetation or just covering it with some kind of attractive mulch or landscaping where small mammals are not going to be easily accessible to barn owls. And then a final option is to initiate nest box programs far away from the interstate so that owls, the population is boosted and they're encouraged to nest not in the death zone. And then we can use the results of the resource selection function to optimize nest box location in areas of habitat that barn owls prefer. Although my research was able to answer some critical questions, it also brought up many more questions that Dr. Beltoff's next grad student is going to address, hopefully. So first, my early breeding season occupancy model and my post-breeding season detection model indicated that background noise negatively affects occupancy and detection of barn owls. But we actually have no understanding of how noise influences seasonal occupancy during the post-breeding season, breeding, and persistence of barn owls. So future research should examine noise effects. Although in general, I-84 was not functioning as an ecological trap, when I took a closer look at some of the segments and my predicted occupancy estimates, I found that there were interstate segments that had extremely high mortality rates corresponding to very low occupancy estimates. And so future research should take a closer look at those areas to see if there's something in those regions that is functioning as an ecological trap for barn owls. Finally, we know occupancy, what predicts occupancy, and in general how that relates to roadway mortality, but we have no real idea of prolonged effects of high rates of roadway mortality on the barn owl population in southern Idaho. In their study in 2012, Boves and Beltoff extrapolated using life history estimates of barn owls from other studies, and they suggested that under current roadway mortality rates, barn owls here in southern Idaho might be at risk of decline. And as such, future studies should look at estimating the population size and breeding density of barn owls, determining the sex and age structure, and also the annual survival rates. Finally, during my movement study, I transmitted or tracked adult males during the breeding season. But we know from many previous studies that females and juveniles experience much greater mortality rates than adult males. So movement studies should be conducted on those two demographics. Also, my study was during the breeding season, but animals should be tracked during non-breeding and peak mortality seasons to see what the behavior and the interaction with the interstate is during those seasons. With that, I would like to thank a long list of people, so sit back and relax. First, I'd like to thank my committee, Dr. Julie Heath, for being there for me in ways that nobody else could be and being my strong woman in science role model. Dr. Jessie Barber, who is always smiling and positive no matter how grumpy and gloomy I was. Dr. Chris McClure, who spent countless hours teaching me, reteaching me, and triple reteaching me occupancy modeling. I think I have 4 hours of video clips on my phone of him and the computer in R showing me occupancy modeling. And then finally, my advisor, Dr. Jim Beltoff, who without his help, patience, and guidance, I wouldn't be standing here today. It's not every grad student who gets to have an advisor who lets them band the barn owls and he goes off and talks with the cows. Jim basically taught me everything I know about barn owls and banding barn owls, and then he let me go and manage the entire nest box program, which was one of the most fun experiences of my entire graduate student tenure. He also spent tons of time in the field with me trying to capture barn owls and then teaching me how to attach the backpack units. This owl actually footed him, which was the only time I've ever seen it happen, but he still kept coming back for more. And then I also got to go out with Jim and install nest boxes in my study area, and this was the most painful part of my graduate experience besides R. So this is the worst ever. We had to hike probably 2 miles to install 3 boxes. This is the beginning of the day, and I'm pretty stoked because Jim is single-handedly carrying this huge heavy ladder. The ladder is a beast. This is 2-3 hours later, we're hiking back to the truck. Jim's still carrying the ladder, and now I'm carrying nothing but the nest box plug. So thanks a lot for saving me from the ladder, Jim. I wouldn't also be here today without my grad school compatriot, Erin Arnold. She was the best. We did a lot of our research together. I helped her with her work. She helped me with mine. This picture is from our literal first day ever doing field work with Jim, checking barn owl nest boxes. Neither one of us had ever seen a real barn owl. So we were obsessed with the baby squirrels. We were finding in the nest boxes.
Don't tell them what happened to the
It
squirrel.
was not a good day. This is Aaron and I at the end of our research. This is us banning barn owls this past spring, and now we know all about barn owls and how horrible they are. They take hot dumps on you while you're banding. They're both screaming, ear-splitting shrieks. This guy's pretending to be a flammulated owl. Anyway, Aaron, thank you so much for everything. You're amazing, and I don't know what I'm going to do without you tomorrow. And then my cohort, I don't know what I would have done without my cohort. I can be a stress cadet, but all of the grad students constantly surrounded me, encouraged me, and I just really appreciate you guys. This is my cohort. All three of these guys were able to defend way before me, so good job, guys. But here I am, I'm going to make it too. And then Bryce and Sean for always carrying my flower power bag. Sarah Ogden was critical in the initiation of the fieldwork of this project. She took a week of her life to come start fieldwork with me, and I had no idea what I was doing, and we were just out at night in the winter, freezing, trying to figure it out. And this is what you look like when you survey for barn owls in the winter. Little pumpkins with reflective vests. And she worked out all the kinks before I was bringing undergrad researchers out with me. So two of the most important undergraduate students helping me with my project were Sarah Porzmani and Andrea Gibbons. And I couldn't have done a fieldwork without them. They were so reliable. They collected excellent data. They were always smiling, even when conditions were miserable. And they never gave up. One night we came back to our hotel room and found that a semi-truck had rolled across the parking lot and through our hotel room at 3 in the morning. At 3 in the morning, we had to move all our stuff, and thank God we were out surveying barn owls instead of in the hotel room. So it's actually dangerous working out there in southern Idaho. My family, my mom and dad, who instilled in me a deep love of nature and a desire to be a good steward of it. They took me picking huckleberries, picking mushrooms, catching frogs, took me hunting when I was little, and 28 years later, we still get to hunt together. And I really love you guys. Thank you so much for everything. My brother Luke, who is a technological wizard. The only reason I have cool PowerPoints and cool figures in my thesis is because of my brother Luke. And then finally, the she-wolf pack, Ellie, Heidi, and Carly. Thank you guys so much for everything, especially being there for me last semester when I was going through hell. This is Team Ricky, and I don't really know what I would do without my little Rickster. Whoa, we're missing him! I deleted him! Anyway, thanks to my little bird Ricky. Anyway, finally, sources of funding, the Idaho Transportation Department, the Raptor Research Center at Boise State University and Department of Biological Sciences, our partners in research, and then countless others. I would like to mention the private landowners. All of my transmitter attachment were taking place on private land. All of the owl nest boxes were on private land, and every single one of the private landowners were absolutely wonderful to work with, and I really, really appreciate them. Sometimes, one night I caught an owl and the woman brought me carrot cake. We ate her carrot cake at 3 in the morning after I caught the owl. So, and then countless others for their help and encouragement and assistance with this project, especially Travis Henman, who is responsible for creating some of the methods we use to recapture barn owls, Alyssa Salmore, Greg Serving, Brent Ingram, and Kevin Warner. And with that, I will take questions.
So questions for Tempe?
Why did you go to males? I mean, I think I know why you did stuff. Not
Yeah, males, first of all, during the breeding season, they're tied to the nest boxes, so it makes them easier to capture and then especially recapture. Juveniles were not transmitted because with the current technology available then, you have to recapture the animal to get the data back. And juveniles make that huge, somewhat maybe huge natal dispersal, so the odds of me ever refining and recapturing were very low. So, and then females, we did want to transmitter females. But by the time we actually were successfully capturing owls, they had already started initiating breeding activities, and we didn't want to disturb females and cause them to abort. And actually, all 4 of those nest boxes successfully fledged 6 or more nestlings. So our activities didn't have a negative effect, I don't think. Yes, Dr. Barber.
Why do you think previous researchers dismissed call playbacks?
I think it's because barn owls are not in Strigidae, they're Tytonidae, and they don't hoot like typical owls to advertise their territory and attract mates. They screech, and it's probably the worst sound you've ever heard. And so I think because of that, I just assumed, well, they're not hooting, they're not going to be responding, and that's what they said. And 2 other studies have looked at the response of barn owls to broadcasts using vocalizations, and they also, although their methods were not completely random, they did also find that barn owls do vocally respond. So I was able to, with those studies, start contributing to research that suggests the opposite. Yes, Andrea.
I just from living in Idaho my whole life, I noticed the areas that the hotspots seem to be particularly prominent seem to be near a lot of dairies.
Mhm.
Did you notice any correlation or notice any relationship between the dairies?
Dairies was a variable I examined in the occupancy modeling, but it fell out. Technically, it fell out. So dairies was a factor in some of the other occupancy models that were close to the top model, but it wasn't in the top model. So dairies are, I would say, important because they facilitate or subsidize high rodent populations, and then barn owls are coming there to hunt. In my resource selection analysis, I also had dairies, but it was highly correlated with other variables, so I had to remove it from the analysis and couldn't look at the effect of dairies to habitat use. Yes, Dr. Heath.
I'm curious about the scavengers of dead barn owls along the roadways. Do you think that influences your designation of hotspots at all, meaning that those spots might be high scavenger hotspots?
Maybe Erin conducted some surveys where she placed barn owl carcasses and then cameras looking at scavenger removal. And I think she actually found that they persisted for quite a long time in the roadway before they were being removed. And I don't think removal by scavengers is that high. However, I'm not necessarily the expert on that question. So I really don't, I think the hotspots are the hotspots. I think the hotspots are capturing where the hotspots are in reality. So, yeah. Do you want to say anything?
No.
Okay. You already did this, you're done.
Is that it? No further questions? Okay, thanks, Tempe.
Thank you guys for coming. If you're interested, I think we're gonna have dinner and drinks at Bar de May at 6:30 tonight. So you are all invited.